All right, we are ready for chapters 5 and 6 of the book of Esther. If you were not here last time, we'll try to catch you up on some of what we've been referring to as providence passages. Hopefully you will mark those. We'll say more about those here in a moment. We're ready for chapters 5 and 6, so let's review where we've been in chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1 was about... All right, Vashti being deposed and dethroning her. All right, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2, Esther becomes queen. She's chosen as queen. Last week, chapter 3. All right, here's Haman's plot to kill all the Jews. And then chapter 4. All right, Esther is informed of the plot and agrees finally to help. At first she thinks it's very dangerous. She may lose her life, and that's important because of what we see her do even tonight. All right, question number 1 for tonight. Write a short summary of chapter 5. What is chapter 5 all about? All right, Esther approaches the king and accepted or rejected by the king. Accepted by the king, and we'll see more information there in just a moment. Chapter 6, question number 2. All right. Yeah, Mordecai is, the king learns that Mordecai has not been honored properly, and then he is honored to much to the disagreement of Haman. We'll see all of that here in just a moment. Question number 3, why did Esther invite Haman to the banquet? Yeah, she's intending to expose him and identify him to the king. All right, here's our outline that we're following from Wiersbe of the book of Esther, the selection of Esther 1 and 2, 3 to 7, the detection of Haman, and 8 to 10, the protection of Israel. We're in that midsection, and we're talking about Esther's courageous intercession. So here was Haman's evil plot that was planned out, chapter 3. Chapter 4, Mordecai's great concern about that, and then Esther's informed of it. And now we're ready in chapters 5 through 7. We'll look only at chapters 5 and 6, but we'll see Esther's courageous intercession. All right. This is not original with me. I'm not sure where I found these 3 phrases. This sounds like Wiersbe. I picked this up a number of years ago. Esther plans a banquet. Haman plans a murder, and the king plans an honor. And that pretty much summarizes chapters 5 and 6. So you got Esther planning a banquet, you got Haman planning a murder, and the king's planning to honor someone, and all this meshes together. And there is obviously providence involved in that. Now, here's chapter 5. Chapter 5, I simply call Esther plans a banquet and Haman plans a murder. Now, 3 things happen here. We have Esther invites the king and Haman to the banquet, and then Esther's wine banquet is where she invites the king to another banquet tomorrow. That delay in time is important. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then here's Haman's plot to kill Mordecai. That all falls apart in the next chapter. But several things that we learn. If you don't have answer to question number 7, be watching for answers to that as we go through. And we'll point out some of these as we go along, and then hopefully have time at the end. All right, let's start verses 1 to 5 here. Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Now, we had just noticed in chapter 4 that Esther had said that finally she would agree that I'll do something. And notice she had said at verse 16 that we will fast for 3 days, which implied prayer we talked about last time. I won't go back into that. So in verse 1 said, now it happened on the 3rd day. I think it's talking about the 3rd day of those 3 days that were mentioned at chapter 4, verse 16. That Esther put on her royal robe and stood in the inner court at the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat in the royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance. In other words, she was in the court area where he could see and take note of the fact that she was out there. Now, verse 2, that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter, and that was in his hand, and then Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Now, there's a practical thing we learned from that. Remember back in chapter 4, what did she say in chapter 4 when Mordecai suggested, you need to go talk to the king? Yeah, this is dangerous to go before the king. You don't just walk in and ask to speak to the king. You don't just ask for an appointment with the king. That if you haven't been invited, I haven't been invited in 30 days. Basically, paraphrasing, I may be put to death. And so here's something I have to conclude at verse 2, that the king had to take note of the fact that he had to know that she would not risk her life to come before him and ask entrance to the king were it not of utter importance. He had to know that here's a woman willing to risk her life. I could take her head off for making the approach to the king. And here's the practical thing that I'm learning from that we as the people of God need to be willing to pay a price and stand alone. And remember what she said back at verse 16? I'm going to try this. But if I perish, I perish. I mean, if this brings an end to it, I'm willing to do what needs to be done. I'm willing to take my stand. I'm willing to do what we can do or what can be done, even if it costs me my life. And so if we don't get anything else tonight, if you learn that lesson, there are going to be times that you're going to have to put your neck out to do what you think to be right. And you may be taking a risk in that. And you may stand alone. In other words, you may be standing there and the rest of the world leaves you, and you may take your stand among brethren and the rest of the brethren leave you standing alone. Now don't minimize that. There may be times you take a stand and the brethren will leave you out on a limb by yourself and cut the limb off for you. Don't think that can't happen. Where you're taking your stand and suddenly everybody's just abandoned you all of a sudden. And there will be people who will secretly support your stand, but they don't have the courage to stand up and clap and say, you're doing the right thing. And Esther has great courage. You see that at chapter 4, verse 16. You see that at chapter 5 and in verse 2. Now verse 3. What did the king say to her? Yes. What do you want, and I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom. I only know of 2 times that statement has been offered by a king. There may have been other times. In fact, I know there were others, but that are recorded. Right here in the book of Esther, and then one in the case of Herod and Herodias, and Mark 6, Matthew 14. Mark 6, I believe, is the one that records up into half of my kingdom. Herodotus, the historian, says that once a year, the ancient historian, said that once a year, there was one day every year the king would grant a request to someone at the table with him, or someone who would be at the table with him, or someone who would be in his presence, and give them whatever they asked for. Now, let's look at where this is found. If you want to make a marginal note or underline, verse 3 mentions, I'll give you up into half my kingdom. Verse 6, he repeats that. And then at chapter 7 and verse 2, he repeats it again. So 3 times in this section, he repeats, I'll give you up into half of my kingdom. Was that to be taken literal? I don't think so. I think it's an exaggeration. It's a hyperbolic phrase. I think it suggests an overstatement for emphasis, because if he literally is offering half of his kingdom, and someone said, okay, I'll take half your kingdom, and he does it again next year, he's losing his kingdom within 3 years. He's going to lose it. Not likely he's going to give half the kingdom. It's much like someone might illustrate it this way. You take someone out to eat and you tell them, get anything you want and I'll cover it. Well, what you mean is anything on the menu. If they want the whole restaurant, they're probably not willing to pay for that. In other words, that's kind of an overstatement for emphasis, get anything you want. Well, that's what he's saying. I'll give you anything you ask for. You just name it and I'll get it for you. And so it was probably an overstatement. Now verse 6, what'd she say? All right. She first says at verse 4, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for them. I want y'all to come today to a banquet. Now this is unique because pulpit observes that ordinarily the custom was for them to dine separately. The king and the queen would dine separately. Evidence of that already seen in the text is she wasn't there, and then neither has she been before the king in 30 days. So they hadn't been together. Make sense? So this was kind of a high request. This was a risky request, seems to me, at verse 4. And the king said, bring Haman quickly. And so the king and Haman came to the prepared feast, or for the prepared banquet that she had prepared, or had her servants at least to prepare for the occasion. All right, now let's move on. Let's go to verses 6 to 8. This was called a wine banquet here. Some have suggested that was not a large feast as much as it would be like we may think of having finger foods. It was not a gigantic feast that she would have prepared. And so the banquet at verse 6 of wine, the king said to Esther, what's your petition, what's your request? And he again says, give up to half my kingdom and it shall be done. There's a textual issue. It's more of a technical thing. You may have a translation where that's missing. He said it at verse 3. Your translation will probably have it at verse 3. Some of your translations will be missing that at verse 6. But anyway, and in most translations or several translations, it's found. I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Now what does she say? Yeah, I'm going to have another feast tomorrow. Basically, she's saying, let's just enjoy this feast. Let's feast together and eat, have this wine banquet, eat these foods. And my request is for you to come to another banquet, and I'll reveal the answer to your question. What is it that I want? Why did I come and approach the king? Why was I willing to risk my life and come into the court and want you to ask me to come in? I'll tell you that tomorrow. So you come to the feast tomorrow. Now, there's some time delay here, and it's seemingly giving time for something to happen when we see the broader picture, and we'll come to that here in just a moment when we finish the chapter. All right. Any questions or comments so far?
Tony, is the word banquet the same in both places, or is one like a wine banquet and one a feast banquet?
I'm not sure it's the same Hebrew word. I'm not sure about that. I am sure about the wording of verse 6. It's called a banquet of wine, where I don't think that was the phrase used in the next, for example, verse 8. Come to the banquet which I'll prepare. And I don't remember that phrase, banquet of wine. Yeah, and that's what I'm guessing, but I don't know that. I can't answer with clarity. It's just interesting. It's called a banquet of wine, and then here's a banquet. Is there a difference? Maybe. Is there not? Maybe. That's about as far as I can go. All right. Start at verse 9 now. At verses 9, we see Haman's plot to kill Mordecai. We're going to see something about bitterness here. We're going to see some practical things here that fit no different than modern day man. So now at verse 9, we see Haman goes out. Haman's joy turns to wrath when he saw Mordecai. So he goes out. And he went out joyful and with a glad heart. Now, he tells me a little bit later, or tells us a little bit later in the context, why is he going out with such a glad, gleeful heart? He's special, he thinks. He thinks, I've been invited by no one. I mean, the queen just wanted me and the king, and so I'm top guy other than the king. I am it. And so he goes bopping out of there with just, his head held high. And when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and what did Mordecai not do? Yeah, everybody else is afraid of him. And Mordecai knows that Haman has set to kill all the Jews, of which Mordecai is one, but he doesn't tremble in his presence. And so I see a man of courage, like I see with Esther. He was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Mordecai is viewed by Haman as a personal enemy, not just a political enemy, not just someone who has a different law. This is a personal enemy. It's become personal with Haman. He hates him. He despises him. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he called his friends and his wife Zeresh. I suppose is how that's pronounced. Now, some have suggested later, let's get ahead of ourselves to chapter 6 and in verse 13, that the word for his friends is the word for wise men. I didn't go back to double check that. Kyle and Datelets talk about that. And they're pretty reputable dealing with the Hebrew. Nonetheless, they suggest that these are not just friends of his, but some of them were wise men who were supposed to be able to predict the future. Well, they do predict the future. Correct or not, they predict the future by the end of chapter 6. But anyway, he brings his friends and his wife together. And what does he tell them? Verse 11. 10, 11, and 12 now. Yeah. Have you ever sat with someone who all they could talk about was themselves? And if you ever veered off of that conversation, it came back to them, and you get off of that. I got a picture that Haman was that kind of guy. You could ask about anything else, and it's going to be about Haman. He's going to come back and talk about Haman and tell you about all he's accomplished and all he's done. So look at verse 11. He talks about his great riches, the multitude of his children. Chapter 9 and verse 10 said he had 10 sons. So he did have a big family. So look how blessed I am. Look at all the riches I've got. Probably he didn't, I'm gathering from his arrogance, that he's not wording this as I've been blessed by God, but look what I have done, what I've built for myself. Look at my wealth, my family that I've got. But that's not all. The king has promoted him and has advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. I'm the top man right under the president or the king. I'm up there. I've been promoted as high as he go, except being king himself, and basically thought of himself as king, as you're going to see later in chapter 6. And besides that, look at verse 12. As Mark just mentioned, Queen Esther invited me and no one else but me and the king to dine with her and the king alone. Wow. He brags, and he brags, and he brags. Yes. Mm-mm. Yeah, he has no clue about that. Now, he knows Mordecai is, but he has no clue who he's dealing with Queen Esther. All he thinks is a person of power and influence, and they're showing interest in me, and that's all that matters. All right, now verse 13, what did he say? Yeah. Now notice how his joy quickly turned to bitterness. And he allows, let's just assume that Mordecai is a bad guy. He's not. But let's just assume in Haman's eyes, he's a bad guy. One bad guy who doesn't bow down and submit to you. He's letting that destroy his entire life. Nixon once said, remember that those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. Pretty good point. And so Haman's destroying himself here by hating Mordecai. His bitterness toward Mordecai is utterly destroying him. Now, verse 14 now. What did his wife and his friend suggest to him? Yeah, build you some gallows where you're going to hang somebody and make it how big? 50 cubits, that's 75 feet on the minimum side. If you go by 18 inches, that's pretty much the standard. Some stretch it out to 21, which would make it 87 feet. 87 and a half, I think. But 75 feet, that's a long way up. I don't know what to compare that to, except I know from the ground to the top of the roof of this building is 45 feet. So you go 30 feet above, that'd be 30 feet, right? Yeah, 30 feet above that, and that's 75 feet. That's a long way. And build that, and then notice their expression. And then they suggested to the king that Mordecai be hanged, then go merrily with the king to the banquet. What does it tell you about them? Heartless, yeah. Here's a guy that's your enemy, that's causing you frustration and won't bow down before you. Just have him killed. Hang him. And then go merrily your way and enjoy that banquet, and that way you're not bothered by this anymore. And so, any questions or comments on chapter 5? We're going to make a note or two about chapter 5 before we go into chapter 6. All right, we talked about this last time, that remember, the name of God's not found in the book. I like what Matthew Henry said: if the name of God is not there, his finger is, meaning his providence is there. So we started marking providence passages. We have all of those marked but one so far, and so we've got one more here, and we have even one more later tonight. So if you weren't here last time, what these are passages that you might want to mark. I've got them marked with a red circle out to the side, so that when I glance at the book of Esther, that I see here's a reference seemingly to some act of providence. Vashti being dismissed, Esther becomes queen, Mordecai's favorite of the king, and we put out to the side a reward. That comes to play in chapter 6. Is he ever going to be rewarded? Well, yeah, a little bit later. There's a year delay. That gives some time. There wasn't an immediate execution of the plan to kill all the Jews. Chapter 4, who knows but what Esther came to the throne for such a time as this. And then prayer was implied. Now let's go to chapter 5. I've just made a note out to the whole chapter, not a single verse. The delay in time to build the gallows. And so what does that have? Well, maybe that's not an act of providence. But it seems to me that this delay, before Esther tells the king what her request is, gives times for the gallows to be built. And therefore, Haman is going to be executed on that. Make sense? Where if she had revealed it the day before, the gallows hadn't been built. So is that an act of providence? I'll leave that to you to decide, but it seems to me that providence is things that we have to raise questions about anyway. We don't always know the details thereof. So you might mark that, chapter 5, as the delay in time for the gallows to be built. Seems to be the timing is just right. Timing is just right for everything. Now, we're going to add more to that list here in a moment, but does that make sense what we're talking about? Providence passages in Esther.
Would you think it'd be providence where she stood before the king and calling her to him?
Could be. Could be. Perhaps. Who knows? To use biblical language. Very well may be. Anything else? Yes. She wanted to be accepted. Good point. I tell you, not only do I see arrogance with Haman, I see impatience with him. Because if his plan is going to be carried out, and in his mind it's going to be, we know it's not, but it's going to be in his mind, Mordecai's going to be killed anyway. He's going to be killed. And so don't worry about Mordecai. Just let him sit there, let him laugh me off for not bowing down before me. You're going to be killed, buddy, within a year because all the Jews are going to be slaughtered. He thinks. But he can't wait on that because of his bitterness is so strong. He's got to rush this up. and go before the king and ask for him to be slaughtered.
We can't wait on it. You can't just kill him. Like, you could kill him a lot of ways, but he's got to make it public. That's what a hanging is.
Yeah.
Everybody see it. And then he's got to go even bigger, like the biggest gallows in town, so everybody, it's an explanation
Yeah.
beyond what he's trying to say.
Which fortifies his importance.
Overreach.
Yes, good point. That what's this guy being hung for? Because he didn't bow not before the king, but before Haman. Oh, wow. So that just elevates him even higher. Arrogance.
There's such a contrast between Esther and Haman, because she was so humble, and that she prepares herself to go before the king, and humbles herself, and it is accepted of them. And Mordecai is so haughty and arrogant that he thinks he doesn't prepare himself for anything but to be receiving accolades for everything that they really deserve.
Absolutely. I want us to contrast two different kinds of people at the end of our study if we have time, and we'll do that hopefully. Let's talk about Esther 6. Mordecai is honored by the king. So let's look at verses 1 to 3, and then we're going to stop and do another providence passage here at verse 1. So let's get verses 1 to 3. The king learns that Mordecai has not been honored. And so that night, the king, this is the very night, waiting for the next banquet. That's interesting now. That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the record of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, every kind of speculation has been made concerning why the one read to the king instead of the king reading himself. Some have even suggested the king couldn't read. I don't have any evidence of that. The king is used to having people do things for him, and that would be one thing. Others have suggested the reading, a man's voice reading or someone reading to him may have the thought may have created drowsiness, and so maybe he would sleep. I don't know what the case was, but nonetheless, he read from the Chronicles before the kings. And what defined verse 2? Yeah, it was recorded in the Chronicles concerning these two thugs, Bigthana and Teresh. Two of the king's eunuchs had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, and that Mordecai had revealed that plot. And so now at verse 3, the king says, has anything been done for him? And the servant's answer was, nothing's been done. No, nothing's been done. Now let's pause for a moment and let's add another passage, providence passage. Let's go to 6 and 1. The sleepless night. Had that been the night before, things could have turned out different. Had it been the night after, I know things would have been different. The timing of this is down to the wire. I mean, we're talking perhaps minutes from Mordecai being killed. That seems to be providence to me, that he wasn't able to sleep, and then that happens to be the section that he reads. That he's not able to sleep. He happens to read that, and he finds out, hey, wait a minute, Mordecai's not been honored. Let's see what we need to do about that. The sleepless night seems to be an act of providence. We're trying to just list providence passages here. All right, let's begin at verse 4. Now, Haman was asked about honoring Mordecai. Let's get this. Look at verse 4. When the king found out about that, so this seems to be in the early hours of the morning by the time they get to this section, and he asked, well, has he ever been honored? The king then asked, who is in the court? In other words, who's out in the court early in the morning? And they said, well, Haman has entered the outer court of the king's palace. And he was coming to tell asking about hanging Mordecai on the gallows. So he's waiting for all the king to do is just ask him to come in, and I'm ready to ask you, can I go hang? Let's execute this plan. I want you to sign off on this plan. Let's kill Mordecai. He won't bow before me. And so he's just minutes away from doing that. And then the king said, servant said, Haman is here. Let him come in. Notice verse 6. What did the king say to him as soon as he come in? He didn't ask him, what do you want? He didn't say, what is your request? What are you doing here? What does he say to him? Now you see arrogance here, because Haman's thought was, well, I don't know of anybody that he'd rather honor than me. And so he's got to be thinking about me. And so that's hilarious. Says, Haman answered, for whom the king delights the honor, what does he say do for him? Verse 8. All right. Not only just a royal robe, but a royal robe that the king has worn. One that belonged to the king. And the horse on which the king has ridden. Now, that may be a little hard, but you think, who would we honor if you thought that the president was the highest in the nation? I want to wear a suit he's worn, and I want to ride in his limousine and ride on his plane and his helicopter. Wow. That's being honored. And let him ride on which has the royal crest or the crown on his head. Put the royal crown on his head. In other words, what's he thinking here? Make him basically king himself. Yeah, the man that you want to honor, treat him like a king is what I would suggest you do for him. And put him in the royal horse, put the crown on his head, give him the royal robe, and then notice the wording. Some translations word it different at verse 9. But parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That's what I suggest you do. Now verse 10. What happens? Yeah. If this were a movie, this would the look on Haman's face would be priceless. The camera would have to catch that if this were a movie. You just picture that look on his face when he said, great idea. That is what needs to be done. I want you to carry it out, and I want you to go do that to Mordecai. Anybody else would have disappointed him, but Mordecai?
He also tells him to give it to the horse to the most noble official and let him do it. So, in essence, the king is saying, this person that I'm going to turn over to is going to be a noble official, and I'm going to let you do it. So you're a noble official, and that wasn't high enough.
No, that's not high enough. What arrogance, you see. So go do that to Mordecai. And then Haman took the robe. Look at verse 11. Can you imagine, remember back over in chapter 5 that he went with his glad heart, and he was supposed to go with this merry heart to the banquet, but he came out with this bitterness. Can you imagine what's going on in his heart in verse 11 when he goes out to Mordecai? Okay, come, the king wants to honor you. Here's the horse, here's the robe, and we're going to parade you through town, and this is the guy that the king wants to honor. Wow. Now, beginning at verse 12, let's get 12 to 14 now, and we're going to get to some practical things here. What happens in 12 to 14? Yeah, things didn't go, how'd it go when you went to the king? Well, it didn't go like I planned. I was planning on killing Mordecai, and I had to parade him through town and treat him like a king. And, well, who suggested that? Well, I did. I was the one that suggested that. But anyway, look at verse 13. His wife said to him, he came to his wise men. There's his wise men, his friend that we talked about a moment ago. These are not just people who have some wisdom, but seemingly the word suggests people who could foretell the future. And so he called them together, and his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent. Now let's stop there. If he is of Jewish descent. And it's difficult to understand how that could be doubtful to her. And here's why. Haman knew that. Chapter 3, verse 6. He called him a Jew. His fellow servants, chapter 3, verse 4, had informed him there is a Jew who will not bow before you. They've been talking about that. The king knew he was a Jew. Chapter 3, verse 10. So it's difficult for me to get my head around how his wife would not have known he was a Jew. But that has something to do with what else she says. Anyway, you may want to comment on that when I get through here. If he is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. In other words, you went out of here when you left this morning, and you were going to go and take him down, and you've fallen before him. You thought you were up here and he was down there, and you've fallen before him. This ain't going to go well for you. You're going to utterly fail in your efforts against Mordecai. Now, that seems to be their prophecy, or maybe I should say their prediction of the future. And so, on what is that based? Seemingly, that's it. And I think that's why she mentions if he is of Jewish descent. I think it's the reputation of the Jews. No matter what has happened to them, they're in captivity, but God took care of them. They haven't been destroyed. They were attacked, and yet God had protected his people. And they've been attacked, and they've been attacked. Oral history had talked about them coming out of the land of Egypt, God bringing them into the land, conquering the land. The report had been widespread. And I think she's saying that this is those Jewish people that we've heard about. And if he's of Jewish descent, so it may not be, we don't know that but that being the case, maybe what she's saying. That being the case, if him being a Jew, this ain't going to go well for you if you're going to fight against him, because God, or their God, has taken care of them. Now, that was a prophecy whether they intended it to be or not. And they were right about that, these wise men and his wife. Make sense? It's not going to go well for you. And it doesn't go well. But he doesn't know that yet. So, at verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs come and said, oh, there is the queen wants you to come to the banquet. Well, he wants to be honored, so he takes off. And that's where we end. And so we're going to cover some other stuff. Any questions on chapter 6? 2 simple chapters. Yes, sir.
In 5 to 14, they gave him to the guy, hell there. This is his wife and 3. The year they turned around and tell him here now he's not going to be victorious because he is a Jew.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how much time transpired between the first and the last. You see the difference?
Approximately a day. Yeah. Because he'd been invited to this feast, and it was going to be the next day, and this is after the next day. So, and he's just now being summoned. So a day has passed, and they made a pretty quick turnaround with reference to their attitude. All right. If you didn't mark these providence passages, chapter 5, the delay in the time to build the gallows, chapter 6 and verse 1, the sleepless night. Let's talk about 2 kinds of people, and then we're going to go to question number 9 in the last few minutes and talk about practical things. There are 2 kinds of people seen in this book, as well as these particular chapters. Here you have Esther and Mordecai, in contrast to Haman. You have Esther and Mordecai are people of God, where you have Haman as a heathen who's outside the fold. They're totally opposite in their standards. Esther and Mordecai are making every effort to serve God, where Haman is merely serving himself. That's a different kind of person. Esther and Mordecai make their plans to harmonize with God. Haman is making his plans against God. You have on the one side, you have Esther and Mordecai seem to be sincere, where he covers his motive on the other side. He is not sincere. He is anything but honest and sincere. Esther and Mordecai are honored, and Haman is doomed, though Haman, any honor he was bringing to himself. What a great man I am. And the world is full of those same kinds of people. Are you like Esther and Mordecai? Or are you like Haman? Do you serve self, or do you serve your God? Do you cover your motive, or are you sincere? Do you make your plans against God? Or do you make your plans for God? What kind of person are you? Practical stuff, isn't it? All right, let's go to question number 9, practical things. We normally don't have a lot of time, so we've got about 4 to 5 minutes. So we're going to cover all of yours. So let's hear them. Say again.
Be careful of what you say before you learn what the circumstance is. It's like hanging.
That's exactly right. Jennifer?
One thing I thought about is that I think all of us would not want to be anything like him, and we wouldn't want to be arrogant like that. But I think a lot of times we do too, that are the things that we have, and only seeing the things that we don't have. I think that
Yeah.
we all do that.
Yeah. I think that's easy to do. I'm well blessed, but here's one thing I want, and that's all that's on my mind. And he wanted Mordecai to bow before him.
That leads, not follow, that never satisfied. That worldly mind starts taking you over, never satisfied. Haman had almost everything he could want. He still was not satisfied.
Yeah. And do you think if Mordecai had bowed before him, he'd be happy? I don't think so. Be something else. Had he killed him, would he have been happy? No, there'd be somebody else he'd want to kill. That's just the nature of that kind of person. What else? And was willing to do that. And there are times we may have to do that, taking our stand for the truth. There have been many a gospel preacher who've risked their lives to take their stand, who in the threat of being beaten, they'd just go ahead and preach the truth. A.C. Grider had someone outside a radio station chase him around the car, threatening to beat him up. And that's happened to a number of guys through the years. They're going to preach the truth no matter what it costs. What else? Or you talking about Mordecai? Yeah.
But what he said earlier about even if it's not done here, someone else will do it. Save the Jews. I mean, I see God working through this. It's always true that there always be a remnant, but God's plan always works.
All right, that's good. That's good. Here's one I'll add, and then see what else you got. Here's a promise faithfully kept. Esther made a promise, I'll go before the king. You ever talk to somebody and they promise they're going to do something, and then when push comes to shove, it didn't so fun and didn't so easy, so they back away from him. They never do what they say. She did what she said, and so her word was as good as her bond. She said she would, and she did. And so she was willing to risk her life. No matter how hard it was, she did what she said she was going to do. So when you make a promise and say, I will, do you do it, even at a cost, or when you see it's costing, you back away? What else?
I wonder too if the two banquets maybe is speak at the right time. I mean, we don't really know why she went to the second banquet, but it appears that for whatever reason, the first one was not the right time to make
Yeah.
her request. So I wondered about that.
That may be, and she might not have known why. She may have seen something, and seemingly that's giving time for something to take place from our overview of that, but whether she understood why.
She spoken to her husband in 30 days apparently, so maybe that was not the first thing she
Yeah,
did.
maybe we ought to have a little wine before we talk much. Good point. Get to know each other a little bit. Here's another one I'll add to what y'all are saying. The sadness of a family that's bound together by wickedness. See that in chapter 5, verses 9 to 14. Here's a family, when they get together, what's their common bond? About the evil they can do. Here's an idea. Here's how you can kill that guy. Here's how you can get him out. Here's what you can do. And here there are families that are bound together. Their bond is their wickedness. That's what holds them together. How sad. What else would you?
Go along with that. They presented that idea, it pleased him, so he had to go away. Just a few verses later, he's parading Mordecai around the square. Wonder if the gallows was that.
Good point. Good point. Good point.
Our view of the situation is limited to what we can see, and that's where the trust in God comes from. When Mordecai and Esther could see the situation, everything would be, it took a lot of trust in God.
It did. Absolutely. One more. There are some things that are worth risking your life to do. There are some things worth risking your life to do and losing your life to do. And Esther thought this was one. All right, next time, chapter 7 and 8.